I have dedicated an enormous amount of time to reflecting on the very process of how we think. I don't mean this in some lofty, abstract, philosophical manner, but rather from a grounded, highly practical perspective. How can we genuinely tell when we have truly grasped a concept? Because here is the deeply peculiar reality of the human condition. The vast majority of us walk through life entirely convinced that we comprehend things that, in truth, we do not understand in the slightest. Allow me to illustrate exactly what I mean. A number of years back, I was attending a dinner party, and a guest casually asked me to break down exactly how a refrigerator functions. Now, considering my background is in physics, I ought to have this down entirely cold, right? So I launched right into a highly technical monologue, diving deep into the laws of thermodynamics, the mechanics of heat pumps, complex compression cycles, and all the dense, scientific terminology. And then, right in the middle of my own sentence, I abruptly stopped myself. I was struck by a very uncomfortable realization. Sure, I was utilizing vocabulary that I was perfectly familiar with, but I wasn't actually clarifying the process at all. I was merely reciting memorized jargon. Had the person asking the question been a young child, or simply an individual with zero background in advanced physics, they would have been left utterly bewildered and entirely lost. And that realization profoundly bothered me. It unsettled me deeply because I recognized that I had mistakenly confused knowing the mere label of a concept with actually comprehending the substance of the thing itself. This exact phenomenon occurs constantly in our everyday lives. We memorize specialized vocabulary. We drill ourselves on complex formulas. We train our brains to recognize familiar patterns. And then we mistakenly equate all of that surface-level familiarity with genuine understanding. However, true comprehension is an entirely different beast. Genuine understanding is precisely what remains after you strip away every single piece of fancy, high-level terminology. So, because of this revelation, I began implementing a new practice that fundamentally revolutionized the way I approach learning anything and everything. I simply started pretending to be a teacher. Now, to be clear, I am not saying I physically stood at the front of a lecture hall every single time I desired to master a new topic. The strategy I adopted was actually much simpler and far more accessible than that. Whenever I stumbled upon a fresh concept or a challenging idea that I truly wanted to absorb deeply, and I mean authentically understand down to its absolute core, I would grab a completely blank sheet of paper. On that page, I would force myself to write out a comprehensive explanation of the subject, acting exactly as if I were instructing someone who possessed zero prior knowledge of the topic whatsoever. I wouldn't gear the explanation toward a fellow physicist, nor would I imagine presenting it to an academic colleague. Instead, I visualized my audience as an individual who had never once encountered terms like thermodynamics, momentum, or entropy. I pictured a naturally curious human being lacking any sort of technical foundation, perhaps envisioning them as a remarkably bright 12-year-old. And I want to share exactly what occurred when I initiated this practice. Every single time I tried this exercise, without a single exception, I would inevitably hit a massive roadblock. I would be cruising along, writing my thoughts out and feeling incredibly confident in my intellect, and then I would suddenly crash into a conceptual wall. I would find myself writing a sentence along the lines of, and subsequently, the system ultimately reaches a state of equilibrium because, and my pen would just freeze. Because of what, exactly? Why does it actually achieve that state of equilibrium? I had genuinely convinced myself that I knew the answer, but the moment I was forced to articulate it using only plain, everyday language, the hard truth was revealed. I didn't know at all. I possessed only a hazy, nebulous grasp of the idea. Sure, I could seamlessly plug the concept into complex mathematical equations, but I was completely incapable of explaining the actual mechanism behind it. That highly specific moment, that incredibly uncomfortable, ego-bruising instance of getting completely stuck, is undeniably the single most vital phase in the entire process of learning. Why? Because that precise second is the exact point where you uncover the stark disparity between what you genuinely comprehend and what you merely falsely assume you understand. The vast majority of individuals go out of their way to actively avoid experiencing this humbling moment. When they inevitably crash into that metaphorical brick wall, they immediately begin to rationalize, whispering excuses to themselves like, Well, I grasp the concept well enough for now, or I really don't require that deep of a mastery of the subject. And so they simply bypass the hurdle and move along to the next topic. But that approach has it entirely backward. That intimidating wall of confusion is the exact location where authentic, lasting learning actually initiates. The strategy I deploy whenever I smack into that inevitable barrier of ignorance is remarkably straightforward. I immediately pivot and return directly to the original source material. I crack open the textbook once more. I purposefully revisit the exact section that I previously falsely believed I had mastered, but this time around, my approach to reading is fundamentally transformed. I am no longer passively scanning the text just to collect a broad array of general information. Instead, I am actively analyzing the material with the sole intention of plugging the exact, highly specific knowledge gap that I just unearthed on my blank sheet of paper. I am navigating the text with a burning, targeted question firmly lodged in my mind. And let me tell you, that focused intention changes absolutely everything about the learning process. You see, during your very first exposure to a new subject, your brain is desperately attempting to soak up every single detail, all at the exact same time. The cognitive load is simply overwhelming. But when you revisit that identical text, armed with a highly specific targeted inquiry, such as, what is the precise mechanical reason this system achieves equilibrium? Your entire mindset shifts. You instantly transform into a focused investigator, hunting relentlessly for one solitary, crucial piece of evidence. You effortlessly skim right past all the introductory fluff and the concepts you have already secured in your mind, and then, almost like magic, you spot the exact sentence or paragraph that directly addresses your inquiry. The answer literally leaps off the page and locks into your mind, and in that moment, you achieve true mastery over it, simply because your brain possessed an urgent, verified need for that precise piece of information. Following that discovery, I immediately pivot back to my completely blank sheet of paper and initiate the writing process once again. With my newly acquired insight, I inevitably manage to push a little bit further down the page until, as is to be expected, I abruptly crash into yet another conceptual barrier. And when that happens, I simply repeat the cycle. I journey right back to the original source material once more. I execute this exact feedback loop over and over again, relentlessly, until I reach a point where I can effortlessly dictate the entire concept, from the very beginning all the way through to the very end, utilizing nothing but simple, everyday phrasing that absolutely anyone could easily follow. Now, I completely understand that, to the casual observer, this methodical approach probably sounds incredibly tedious. And, to be perfectly honest with you, on certain days it definitely can be. However, here is the most fascinating revelation I have uncovered. It is genuinely exponentially faster than the conventional methods the vast majority of individuals utilize to study. Most students and lifelong learners will mindlessly scan through their heavy textbooks or lengthy class notes multiple times, meticulously highlighting entire paragraphs, crafting endless stacks of vocabulary flashcards, and desperately attempting to force-feed their brains through rote memorization. They will happily burn through countless hours agonizing over the material, yet, when the session finally concludes, they still fail to possess any genuine comprehension of the subject. All they have managed to accomplish is turning themselves into experts at merely recognizing the visual cues of the material when it is placed directly in front of them. Conversely, when you actively employ this specific pedagogical method, when you ruthlessly force your own brain to articulate the material using your completely unique phrasing, you are engaging in a cognitive exercise that is infinitely more powerful and effective. You are no longer merely parroting someone else's prepackaged explanation. Instead, you are painstakingly constructing your very own intellectual architecture from the foundational dirt all the way up to the roof. And the beauty of that foundational kind of comprehension is that it truly, permanently sticks with you. You don't just miraculously forget every single detail the week after you take the final examination. Rather, that deep-seated knowledge literally transforms into an intrinsic component of your mental framework. It becomes a fundamental part of the way you think and process the world. Allow me to offer you a highly practical example that steps completely outside the realm of theoretical physics, because I strongly believe that this framework applies to absolutely every single topic in existence, not merely the hard sciences. Let us imagine for a moment that you harbor a desire to truly comprehend exactly how a democracy operates. I am not talking about memorizing the dictionary definition. You can easily pull out your phone and look that up on the internet in under 10 seconds. But I mean truly, deeply grasping the mechanics of it. How would you actually achieve that? Well, the traditional route would be to read lengthy historical texts regarding democratic systems. You could learn all about the separation of powers, the concept of checks and balances, the intricacies of representative government, and all those associated theories. And after doing so, you might genuinely feel a false sense of confidence, believing you thoroughly understand the system. But I challenge you to attempt this alternative method instead. Pull out a crisp, entirely blank sheet of paper and attempt to rationally explain to a purely imaginary audience member exactly why a democratic system fundamentally tends to function more effectively than an autocratic dictatorship. The catch is, you are strictly forbidden from utilizing any fancy political buzzwords, and you are not allowed to simply quote the historical writings of the Founding Fathers. You must articulate the entire argument relying solely on your own conversational vocabulary, building the case entirely from fundamental first principles. You might initiate your draft by jotting down something seemingly straightforward, such as, "A democracy is effective because the general public gets to cast a vote for their preferred leaders." Okay, that is a start, but you must ask yourself, why exactly does that mechanic make the system superior? You might respond, because that specific dynamic forces the elected leaders to execute the desires of the populace. But do they actually do that? What tangible mechanism actually prevents those politicians from completely disregarding the wishes of the public the very second they secure their elected office? You might counter with, well, if they do that, they will simply be voted out of power during the next election cycle. But wait, what happens if those same leaders decide to manipulate and rewrite the electoral laws so that they can never legally be removed from their positions? What precise barrier actively prevents them from executing that corrupt maneuver? Do you see exactly what is unfolding here? You are systematically unearthing the logical gaps in your own understanding, and those specific voids are exactly the territory where the truly fascinating, deeply intellectual questions reside. Suddenly, you find yourself forced to ask, why do we absolutely require an entirely independent judicial system? Why is maintaining the absolute freedom of the press such a critically important pillar within a functioning democracy? Why is the concept of a peaceful transition of power so fundamentally necessary? These concepts are no longer just lofty, abstract academic ideas floating in the ether. They immediately transform into highly practical, necessary solutions to extremely specific societal problems. Problems that you yourself organically discovered only when you attempted to reconstruct the entire conceptual framework from absolute scratch. And when you finally circle back and read those heavy historical texts regarding democracy, armed with the experience of having mentally wrestled with these exact same dilemmas, every single detail suddenly clicks and makes logical sense in a profound way that it simply did not before. You are no longer just blindly memorizing random historical facts about democratic institutions. You genuinely comprehend the specific architectural reasoning behind why the system is structured exactly the way that it is. This exact scenario perfectly encapsulates what I mean when I discuss the vast, gaping chasm between merely memorizing the label of a concept and genuinely possessing the substance of the concept itself. Simply learning the name of a thing is an incredibly easy, low-effort task. Truly understanding the inner workings of the thing, however, demands intense cognitive labor. But I can promise you, it is precisely that specific brand of intellectual labor that will actually propel you forward and yield meaningful results. Furthermore, there is another immensely critical component to this overall philosophy that I believe is absolutely essential to highlight. When you force yourself to articulate a complex topic using completely rudimentary, simple language, you permanently strip away your ability to hide your ignorance behind the shield of industry jargon. Now, do not misunderstand me. Jargon certainly has its rightful place and utility. In many professional environments, it serves as a highly efficient shorthand that allows seasoned experts to communicate complex ideas with rapid precision. However, it concurrently functions as an incredibly dangerous intellectual trap. It acts as a trap because it provides you with the perfect camouflage to deceive your own mind, tricking you into falsely believing that you have mastered a difficult subject, when, in reality, you merely possess a passing familiarity with the phonetic sounds of the advanced vocabulary. I will gladly offer you a prime example drawn directly from my own professional domain. Within the highly complex field of quantum mechanics, physicists frequently utilize the terminology wave function collapse. Year after year, university students diligently memorize this specific term. They learn how to flawlessly plug it into complex equations, and they can easily secure passing grades on rigorous academic examinations centered around it. Yet, if you were to pull one of those students aside and ask them to plainly articulate what that phrase actually signifies in a literal, physical sense, what is actually transpiring in physical reality, the overwhelming majority of them would be entirely incapable of giving you a straight answer. They stumble because they have simply been trained to regurgitate the terminology without ever having invested the necessary mental energy to construct a genuine, working mental model of what the scientific phenomenon actually represents. And this exact same pattern of self-deception plagues absolutely every single professional field in existence. Take the medical industry, for instance. Highly trained doctors will frequently diagnose a patient by citing an idiopathic condition. But do you actually know the literal definition of the word idiopathic? It is essentially a dressed-up way of stating we have absolutely no idea what is causing this illness. However, utilizing a deeply clinical, multisyllabic term sounds infinitely more authoritative and impressive than simply admitting to a patient, "We just don't know." You see the exact same behavior in the corporate business sector. Executives and managers constantly throw around buzzwords like synergy, process optimization, and leveraging our core competencies. But if you pause and demand to know what those corporate phrases actually translate to in the real world, what do they mean? More often than not, they mean absolutely nothing of specific substance. They are merely comfortable, safe, professional-sounding filler words that allow individuals to entirely bypass the excruciatingly difficult labor of engaging in sharp, precise, rigorous, critical thinking. When you aggressively mandate that you must break down a concept entirely devoid of that protective layer of jargon, you completely eliminate your ability to pull off that intellectual sleight of hand. You are left with no other choice but to genuinely, authentically comprehend the underlying mechanics of what is actually happening. And if you find yourself utterly incapable of explaining the topic in a simple, straightforward manner, that failure is an enormous flashing neon sign. It is a glaring indicator proving that your comprehension of the subject is nowhere near as profound as your ego led you to believe. Now, I feel a deep obligation to warn you. Embarking on this process is an incredibly humbling, sometimes ego-shattering experience. When I initially began applying this rigorous methodology to my own life in a serious manner, I was utterly appalled by the sheer volume of fundamental concepts that I firmly believed I possessed a mastery over, only to discover I was completely clueless. I mean, consider my background. I am a credentialed physicist. I have been honored with prestigious industry awards. I have stood at podiums and lectured at top-tier universities. And yet, despite all of those accolades, the moment I forced myself to sit down with a blank page and attempt to translate foundational scientific concepts into elementary language, I unearthed massive gaping voids in my own knowledge base virtually everywhere I looked. But the truth is, that realization is a wonderful thing. That is the entire purpose of the exercise. The ultimate objective of learning is not to simply puff up your chest and feel intellectually superior. The true objective is to cultivate genuine, undeniable competence. And unshakable competence is born strictly out of a radical, unflinching honesty with yourself regarding the boundary line between what you truly know and what you remain utterly ignorant of. Furthermore, there is an entirely different, incredibly beautiful byproduct that I have consistently observed when employing this specific learning framework. Once your comprehension of a subject reaches a depth where you can effortlessly explain it in simplistic terms, your brain suddenly begins to recognize fascinating interconnected patterns that were completely invisible to you prior to that moment. You rapidly begin to observe that the exact same foundational mechanics are secretly operating behind the scenes across a wildly diverse array of different scenarios. For instance, the mechanical process that allows your kitchen refrigerator to keep your food cold, is not fundamentally all that different from the internal workings of your home's air conditioning unit, or even the mechanics powering a traditional heat engine. At their very core, every single one of these machines is simply transferring thermal energy from one location to another by utilizing the exact same universal ideas. And the magical part is, the moment you authentically lock down an understanding of those core universal ideas, you gain the superpower to analyze and solve entirely novel situations without ever needing to exhaust yourself by memorizing every single isolated specific case. This exact phenomenon is precisely what intellectuals and innovators are referring to when they drop the popular buzzword, first principles thinking. I will admit, I harbor a bit of distaste for that particular phrase simply because it projects an aura of elitism and sounds far fancier than the reality of the concept. Stripped of the hype, the concept simply dictates this. If you dedicate the effort to understanding the absolute, bare-bones fundamentals to an extraordinary degree, every single subsequent challenge you face becomes infinitely more manageable and dramatically easier to solve. During my tenure as a professor, I frequently had frustrated students approach my desk during office hours, practically pulling their hair out as they complained, "Professor Feynman, I swear to you, I have read through this exact same textbook chapter 3 separate times, and my brain still just cannot grasp the material." In response, I would simply look at them and ask one question. Have you genuinely attempted to write out your own personal explanation of the chapter on a blank piece of paper? Almost invariably, they would admit that they had not. They operated under the deeply flawed assumption that the mere act of running their eyes over words on a page was synonymous with the act of learning. However, passively reading a text is nothing more than the preliminary, introductory step. Genuine, rock-solid understanding is only forged through aggressively engaging in combat with the material, mentally wrestling with the conflicting ideas, and painstakingly attempting to reconstruct the architecture of the concept entirely within the confines of your own imagination. On occasion, these students would push back against my advice, protesting, "But, Professor, I simply don't possess enough knowledge regarding the topic to formulate an explanation just yet." And to that, I would immediately reply, "That exact feeling of inadequacy is the precise reason why you must attempt to explain it immediately." You see, the very act of struggling to articulate the topic is the exact mechanism that illuminates the specific areas of your ignorance. You absolutely must not passively wait around until a magical aura of understanding descends upon you before you attempt to teach the material. The process operates in reverse. You must actively force yourself to explain the material for the explicit purpose of ultimately understanding it. It heavily echoes that ancient, oft-repeated educational proverb. You can never claim to truly know a subject until you are capable of successfully teaching it to another person. However, I would actually push that philosophy one significant step further. I firmly believe that you do not genuinely comprehend a concept until you possess the ability to successfully teach it to an individual who does not naturally speak your specific industry language, and who absolutely does not share your pre-established baseline of assumptions. That is the ultimate, uncompromising litmus test of true intellectual mastery. And here is what I find to be the most profoundly beautiful aspect of this entire mental framework. Its application is universal. It works flawlessly for absolutely everything in human existence, extending far, far beyond the rigid confines of academic textbooks and university lectures. You can effectively utilize this exact same strategy to dissect and comprehend the mechanical workings of your vehicle's engine, the complex macroeconomic forces shaping global markets, or even the nuanced emotional dynamics that dictate the health of your relationship with your spouse. The undeniable truth is this: if any given subject is genuinely worth the effort of understanding, then it inherently deserves the dedicated effort of being broken down and explained in the absolute simplest terms imaginable. Let me share with you one additional, highly fascinating observation I have made over the years regarding this technique. When you commit to explaining complex ideas using this highly personalized, ground-up approach, you very frequently arrive at a final explanation that looks and sounds drastically different from the official version printed in the textbook. This does not mean your version is scientifically incorrect. It is simply structurally different. You approach the problem from a totally unique vantage point. You invent entirely different metaphorical analogies to illustrate your points, and you choose to place heavy emphasis on completely different aspects of the system. And that outcome is not merely acceptable, it is actually exponentially better than simply copying the textbook. It is superior because that specific customized explanation belongs entirely to you. You are the architect who built it. You intimately understand the structural integrity of every single supporting beam and conceptual piece within that mental model, purely because your own hands were the ones that meticulously placed them there. This reality stands in direct, stark opposition to the primary methodology championed by our modern educational systems. The vast majority of traditional schooling endeavors to simply hand you someone else's pre-chewed, fully processed understanding, conveniently wrapped up in a tidy, completed package. The standard directive is simply, read this specific text, memorize this designated information, and adopt this specific framework for thinking about the problem. However, authentic cognitive understanding simply cannot be transferred between human beings in such a sterile, transactional manner. You absolutely cannot just digitally download another human being's hard-earned comprehension directly into your own brain like a computer file. You are fundamentally required to construct your own internal blueprint. Consider the concept utilizing this highly relatable culinary analogy. If I harbored a deep desire to teach you how to cook a phenomenal meal, I could easily just hand you a stack of precise, step-by-step printed recipes. I could dictate to you the exact chemical measurements of every ingredient to utilize, the specific temperature to set your appliances to, and the precise exact duration to leave the dish on the stove. And realistically, if you followed my rigid instructions with robotic precision, you would very likely produce a fairly decent-tasting meal. But the critical distinction is this: you would not possess the actual skill of knowing how to cook. Because the very first instance where chaos ensues, perhaps you discover you are completely missing a vital ingredient, or perhaps your specific oven calibration runs significantly hotter than mine, or maybe you suddenly need to double the portion size to feed unexpected guests. You would immediately find yourself paralyzed, panicked, and utterly lost in the kitchen. However, envision an alternate scenario where, instead of handing you a rigid list of instructions, I invested the time to educate you deeply on the underlying scientific principles of the culinary world. What if I taught you exactly how applied thermal heat fundamentally alters the molecular structure of animal proteins? What if we explored the specific chemical reaction detailing how salt actively enhances dormant flavor profiles? How animal fats act as the ultimate delivery vehicle for complex aromatics? And how citrus acidity cuts through and perfectly balances overwhelming culinary richness? If I dedicated myself to teaching you those universal foundational principles, you would suddenly possess the immense power to figure out any culinary hurdle entirely on your own. You would be fully capable of brilliant improvisation. You could passionately create your own original dishes from scratch, and you would permanently outgrow any reliance whatsoever on my pre-written recipes. That exact sense of boundless intellectual liberation is precisely what this specific method of rigorous, simplified learning achieves. It actively installs the bedrock principles into your mind. It relentlessly forces you to comprehend the fundamental, mechanical reality of how things actually operate in the physical world, rather than merely programming you to follow a blind, sequential list of predetermined steps. And here is the ultimate, undeniable truth of the matter. This specific methodology is not merely a tool designed for conquering academic subjects. It is an indispensable foundational tool designed for navigating the complex journey of living. Because the reality is, life will relentlessly and unapologetically hurl highly chaotic, entirely unprecedented situations in your direction. Situations that have absolutely no precedent and cannot be found in the index of any published textbook. You will face entirely novel problems, wildly unexpected challenges, and bizarre scenarios that you have never once laid eyes upon before. And if you have carelessly spent the entirety of your existence simply memorizing the convenient, pre-packaged solutions handed down by other people, you will find yourself completely, tragically unprepared for those moments. But conversely, if you have purposefully dedicated your life to mastering the intricate art of independent, ground-up critical thinking, If you have rigorously practiced the discipline of systematically breaking massive things down and meticulously building them back up in your own unique words, then you will possess the mental fortitude to handle pure novelty. You will always retain the power to figure things out, no matter the circumstance. In my deepest estimation, this philosophy embodies exactly what the entire institution of modern education truly ought to be structured around. The ultimate objective should absolutely never be filling people's heads with random trivia facts, nor should it be training young minds merely to pass standardized examinations. The true goal of education must be to teach human beings exactly how to critically think, how to courageously question authority, how to forge genuine understanding, and above all else, how to maintain a radical, unwavering honesty with themselves regarding the strict boundaries of what they know and what they don't. And all of that massive intellectual transformation begins with something as stunningly ordinary as a completely blank piece of paper, paired seamlessly with a genuine willingness to look in the mirror and openly admit that you might not grasp a concept quite as masterfully as you originally thought. That is quite literally all it takes. It requires a willingness to occasionally be entirely wrong, to possess an incomplete picture of reality, and to publicly embrace the identity of someone who is still actively learning. Because, if I may share a closely guarded secret with you, absolutely every single human being is still actively learning. Every single one of us, without exception. The absolute smartest person currently walking the face of the world spends the vast majority of their time deeply confused about most things. The sole, defining difference is merely the fact that some of us possess the courage to openly admit it, while others exhaust themselves pretending that they are not. I have genuinely spent the absolute entirety of my life dwelling in a state of confusion, and quite frankly, I still am. But I have successfully learned to become incredibly comfortable residing within that fog of confusion, simply because I deeply recognize that the state of not knowing is entirely temporary. I carry the absolute certainty that if I just sit down quietly with a blank piece of paper and painstakingly work my way through the problem step by methodical step, relying exclusively on clear, simple language, eventually the chaos will inevitably make sense. Perhaps that moment of clarity won't arrive today, and perhaps it won't even materialize by the end of this week, but I know with absolute certainty that eventually it will. Ultimately, I believe that is the most profound, overarching lesson to be extracted here. Genuine, deep-rooted understanding is not some sort of mystical magic trick. It is absolutely not a predetermined trait that you are either miraculously born with or tragically denied. It is merely work. It is patient, humble, highly honest work. It is the gritty process of trying to explain something complex, brutally locating the exact spot where you get stuck, humbly retreating back to your source material, and valiantly trying the entire grueling process all over again, repeatedly, until it finally clicks securely into place. And let me assure you, when that mental mechanism finally does click, when you reach that elevated plateau where you finally genuinely understand a complex subject, when you possess the capability to explain it with crystal clarity and beautiful simplicity, and when your mental vision can see all the way through to the foundational core, that exact sensation stands unrivaled as one of the single best feelings in the entire world. This immense satisfaction does not arise because the achievement somehow makes you inherently special. Rather, it fills you with joy because it serves as undeniable proof that you have accomplished something intensely real. You have successfully added profound value to your own internal character. You have authentically grown. And the most inspiring part of all is that you hold the power to execute this transformative process with absolutely anything, at absolutely any age. You truly never stop possessing the ability to learn. You simply have to be willing to pick up that blank piece of paper, grip your pen, and courageously start writing.